Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Civil War Seattle and our, is it June already, edition of First Wednesdays with Savas Beatie authors. And tonight I am extremely excited to welcome Ernest Dollar to talk about his recent book, Hearts Torn Asunder, and which was recently reviewed by the New York Times, I've been informed, just this weekend. So we have a superstar author on hand this evening. To be superstar author. So Ernest, why don't you start off telling us a little bit about your background, education, how you got interested in this topic, history, the Civil War, what you're doing professionally now, and then what led into this book. We'll transition into the book after that.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm excited to talk about the book. New York Times is a big, exciting thing. So I'm trying to still kind of ground myself and pull myself out of the clouds. I started this book. I really came interested in the Civil War my junior year in college. It was when Ken Burns' series came out. I discovered living history. And I just discovered that the war swirled around where I grew up here in Durham, North Carolina. So I really just gravitated to understanding appreciation for local history with, this national story. And I was really shocked to find that it ended almost in my backyard. So it started a lifelong love of trying to understand and Civil War. And it evolved in trying to understand what was it like for these men to fight this war and to go through that experience. So I kind of cobbled this book together 20 years ago, but I looked around and there were much more eloquent authors who had done a better job of trying to do this military historical narrative. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to try to find some way to spin this book in a different way. Right about the same time, I started working on a screenplay. So one of the things I wanted to do is to write, to talk about veterans in movies. And it's almost like a cliche. All these veterans are really crazy and they're crazy characters. And the more I tried to get into understand that experience, I kind of realized, well, maybe these stereotypes are based in anything. So I really understood, tried to delve into what veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan were going through and what they were trying to reintegrate into society. And so once I understood that experience, I went back to the historical record, these documents and letters that I've been looking at for years and reread them. And to my surprise, I found so many of these accounts were pregnant with how they felt, just these incredible strange behaviors. And they were just bogged down by the mental and moral stress of the war. So I said, this might be the direction to take the book. So I basically had to rewrite it, paying special attention to, the emotional and psychological mindset of these men and women who found themselves in an incredible whirlwind of a storm at the very end of the Civil War here in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what I like about the project too is even in recent years, there's been some great scholarship just on, that idea of post-war trauma for soldiers and medical issues and those sort of things. But they're often a little bit almost out of context because we're isolating sort of them as case studies and that sort of thing. But what I like with what you've done is we're looking more cause and effect. We're looking directly at this situation, where these things and these individuals situations originate from. Not, we'll talk about that. Some of these things are from 3 or 4 years of campaigning and fighting and the ferocity of the battles at Atlanta, then the stress of the March to the Sea. Didn't all just happen in North Carolina, but there's a bowl that it's all being mixed together in there right at the end of the war, which is a much different and refreshing approach. I think I like that. It's a lot less sterile and more human and place-based. And we had talked before we went on that I had spent time in my youth in that specific area of North Carolina on those battlefields, and then giving that individual feel it resonates more. And I think it's really interesting that you've approached it that way.
Yeah, and I kind of built it that way for a very distinctive purpose. I had my first job out of college was working at the Bennett Place Historic Site, and as the United States, the largest surrender of the American Civil War, I thought it would be just overwhelmed with tourists and people coming in. But the
Yeah.
biggest request I found is, where was the bathroom? So I was really shocked at why we as a nation and as Civil War scholars and enthusiasts and buffs, how does this final campaign of the Civil War in Bennett Place, the largest surrender of the war, just totally evaporate in our historical consciousness? So I really wanted to dissect it and see if there was something really behind our national amnesia on Bennett Place. And so I purposely did it day by day, because what I found in studying these last week or 2 weeks or a couple of months of the war is that the emotion of people are just up and down. They're all over the place. And these amazing, shocking national events are causing such whiplash in the emotions of these people that I wanted to take the reader on this day by day journey, because no one day is the same as the next, because all of these factors are coming in and influencing it. And to really bring it down to trying to look at trauma on a campaign level it's something I've never seen before, but it shows you that direct cause and effect that really triggered a lot of this trauma, like you said, that a lot of these people brought to North Carolina. So it's not the apocalyptic campaign they were on that really did it, but it's all this trauma they brought with them. And these crazy events in the last days is really what unlocked that and flourished. And you can really see it on full display in their diaries and what they're doing and their journals, and just how these events ground to a home.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that sort of amnesia, because I've seen that referenced by historians about the Overland campaign as well, that there's a little bit of a black hole in memory from the veterans, and they almost feel like it's been tamped down a little bit. And it was in a way because they didn't want that was so hideous and so ferocious and so much worse than some of the other aspects of the war, that they simply kind of blocked some of these things out. And it seems like maybe that's in a similar manner to what you're saying happened here at the end in North Carolina as well, where it was there was nothing to glorify in it. There weren't monuments like Gettysburg. There wasn't a grand charge like Fredericksburg. It was just harsh and ugly. And so with that in mind, why don't you kind of set the stage for us a little bit as to what's happening, where you pick up in the book is post Battle of Bentonville, it's post Eversboro, and kind of set the stage with where things are, where you pick up your narrative and your story from.
Sure. Well, whenever you talk about Sherman, he magically disappears after the March to the Sea. The Army of Tennessee just disappears after Nashville, but these people came together. So I really, I start on April 10th, 1865 in Goldsboro, and it is it's an incredible moment where Sherman, who has marched all the way through the Carolinas up through South Carolina, leaving from Savannah after his incredibly successful march to the sea. So he's made his way to Goldsboro. He resupplies there. He receives 20,000 reinforcements. So his army is pushing 89,000 soldiers. The Confederates had made a desperate attempt to try to stop Sherman in North Carolina, the Battle of Bentonville you talked about, which were just a ragtag patchwork army thrown into the field to try to pull off a miracle. So the day begins as these two armies are starting to move into the interior of North Carolina along the North Carolina Railroad, and sort of the breadbasket of the state that holds most of the population of the capital city of Raleigh, to Greensboro, Hillsboro, on down to Charlotte, Salisbury. So it's this great arc that goes across the state along this main railroad line. And what has happened is that Sherman, while he was in Goldsboro, leaves to meet with Lincoln and Grant in Virginia to come up with a plan about how are we going to end the war and reunite the nation. And so Sherman is supposed to, the entire plan was to go to Virginia to help Grant pry Lee out of the Petersburg and earthworks. But with the breaching of those on April 2nd, Sherman's now, his goal is to try to destroy Joseph E. Johnston's, the last remaining major Confederate army in the field. So no longer is he going north to Virginia, but he's coming west. And so the campaign just picks up a day after Appomattox and goes all the way to May 4th, when Union Army, after the surrender, goes north and leaves the state.
So what's the sort of story on the ground in that section of North Carolina? It certainly hasn't been suffered the ravages of Central Virginia with marching armies back and forth and campaigning across. It's certainly deprived of manpower to a massive degree, because North Carolina fueled the Army of Northern Virginia rather than defending its own state. So when we're looking at what the condition is of the territory Sherman's army has not passed through yet, no major battles have been fought through there. Is it suffering for food and provisions and things like other areas of the South, or it's, we talk about the deserters that are leaving the Army of Northern Virginia at that time, and other than the two army camps, what else how else does North Carolina look, that region?
What we see is a great displacement of people. Ever since the first months of the war, North Carolina is occupied, and that beachhead the Union Army makes in late 1861 expands. And so we see, Union Army surging inland to Goldsboro to fight in 1862, Roanoke Island, all of the, a lot of skirmishing up and down the coast. And so we see a surge of refugees pack into the center of the state, which, just a lot of shortages. You have an incredibly displaced population who are bringing in a lot of African Americans with them, a shortage of cash. They're starting to spread disease across the state. Wilmington has a huge yellow fever outbreak. Smallpox is seen up against this sort of industrial corridor down North Carolina. So besides that, North Carolina is truly suffering a lot of shortages as well, like most any other southern state. And North Carolina had perhaps one of the largest populations of military-aged men to go to Confederate service, especially in the Army of Northern Virginia and a few regiments of the Army of Tennessee. So it is just a destabilized place of the first rate that we see that these armies are moving into. So that the tremors they cause just upset so much of the already upset population that North Carolina is just trying to protect and to house, because we as Sherman moves through South Carolina, a huge influx of those people coming from Columbia and Upper South Carolina. So it's just a madhouse, I would say, of humanity trying to find safety and shelter amidst this oncoming storm.
Yeah. So let's talk about the oncoming storm a little bit, and we can kind of move into the stories of the soldiers that are the main players in this drama militarily. We have Sherman's troops and what they've suffered and what they've been through on the march to the sea and the difficult campaigns in the summer of 1864, and so on. The Army of the Army of Tennessee, to put it as lightly as possible, has struggled and had their butts handed to them in a can as worse as any army in the Civil War. So what's happening with these men? What are they feeling? What are they going through? They're a little bit in limbo because the army isn't surrendered, but they're not really fighting. They're kind of stationary, as I understand it. And there's just a lot of moving pieces that come into this place and then aren't moving anymore as large bodies, but there's still trouble within some different situations, like the surrender of Raleigh and some other things that you mentioned in your book. So what's happening with the troops that are now moving into this area?
One of the surprising things I really found is when after Nashville, when the Confederate Army of Tennessee is trying to recover and the Confederacy is trying to make a game plan, and they decide to ship all of these men to North Carolina, to Joseph Johnston, to try to stop Sherman. I was really shocked at their trauma is on full display as they move across the South. And I try to point out in the book is that these troops, they stop in these different cities and they just kind of go crazy. They trash the city, they get really drunk, and they just incite such fear in southern cities as they move, because these guys are trying to deal with this incredible trauma of these two horrific battles of Franklin and Nashville. So they are just angry and just tore up as far as their mental state, and trying to throw back into another battle of Bentonville just a few months after these incredible battles of Tennessee. Um, they're truly starting to show just how some of them really believe in the Confederacy still has a chance, and sort of believe that they won't let them believe that defeat is at hand. And then you have others that are just so downtrodden that they're ready to desert, ready to give up the cause. And so it is truly an army that you really see the men are just ground down to their most basest emotional forms. Sherman is quite the opposite. His march to the sea is quite victorious. Union soldiers are living off the land. But, especially when they start moving into South Carolina, a really dark change happens in these guys that, not only are they moving into the very den of secession, where secession started, and they blame South Carolinians for the war in no uncertain terms. And, Sherman even said that he trembles at the fate of South Carolina with this army moving in. And so these guys, the chance for revenge for all of their lost comrades and the duress of the nation, they're going to extract that revenge. And so they really bring a really dark and ugly warfare to South Carolina. And oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask, while you're right where you're at with what you're explaining, you've mentioned, we've used the word trauma a lot. It's on the cover of the book. It's come up a few times. I'd like to maybe have you expand on that a little bit, because you're hinting at the idea that there's some accumulation of this that has been happening and is really, like you said, you can really start to see it bubbling to the surface in their writings and their behaviors and things. But perhaps you can explain what you mean by trauma when you talk about that. Is it just battlefield experience? Is it just the anguish of being away from home, or with the Confederates, the unknown of what's even happened at home? When you talk about seeing this, and you're seeing it in their writings, in their diaries and things, what sort of things are you seeing, and what do you think some of these underlying particular causes are?
Yeah, and so and that's sort of the real crux of the book, is to make the statement that we as humans have not really evolved very far from the Civil War. In fact, for thousands of years, we've kind of been the same mechanically built brains in our bodies. And so I kind of look at, how do we define trauma in veterans today? And we're specifically looking at symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. And once we look at the diagnosis of those folks, I can turn almost to any page and see some of the same symptoms up here in these men and women I talk about. So a lot of it is we see them acting in ways that are just emotionally broken down. I talk about Newell Gleason, who was the colonel of the 87th Indiana, that he would be sitting by the campfire and weave between incredibly laughing and having fun to next minute like bawling and crying. And he was afraid that so many there's a plot to remove him from command, and just acting in ways that do not belie what a normal person would act like. Mm-hmm. So we see so many of the deep writings of people just suffering so much depression, anxiety, stress, to the point that it is they're losing weight, they're acting differently. We see women or who have just been overwhelmed by such grief of losing family and friends that they became opium addicts or alcoholics. So, and one of the things that I think that really plugs into trying to define trauma is that we see a morality change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even the experience from going from a civilian to soldier is a part of that change. But once we see soldiers talk about being hardened, right? That
Mm-hmm.
emotional numbness, and that's a classic post-traumatic stress disorder. And throughout any Civil War literature, the hardened soldier. And it's just like a collection of behaviors and thoughts that really tip me off that these people are deeply troubled.
Mm-hmm.
And so just trying to look to the historical record and pluck those out. And more, we see more and more of that if you just look for it in those accounts.
Yeah. So what, for the historians here that are watching, which there are a few that love to know and love to dig into the primary source material, where did you find the greatest wealth of sources for this? Were they in institutional collections and University of North Carolina and diaries and letters and things, or did you get more from newspapers, or what was your best source, I guess, of collectively of material, and what was perhaps your most surprising, where you found things you didn't expect to find that maybe opened your eyes to some of what you're talking about, that you had to know what you were looking for to see it?
That's an interesting question. So yes, certainly those primary sources that were written there and then, truly, they let their guard down. It's such this emotional time that you really catch a glimpse of their inner soul, for lack of a better term. So certainly that played an important role to capture the very moment and what they were thinking at the end of the war. Now, to kind of bookend that were the secondary sources, like after years down the road. I found those very interesting as they reflected on that experience. And they had already tried to reintegrate back into Northern and Southern societies. How did they temper their stories? And how did what they said in 1885 mismatched or matched what they said in 1865? So that's kind of a yardstick that I use to try to understand how did this traumatic chapter influence the memory of that chapter.
Sure.
But yeah, certainly, trying to finish up the book in COVID was not fun. So I'm so happy that a lot of these institutions digitize their collection. I mean, it's a godsend for us.
Yeah, I exist simply through that. I mean, for my geography of being so far away from the letters at the UNC, but yeah, it's the digitization has really enabled me, and certainly during the pandemic. It's a great age to be a historian and a researcher that way.
Oh, it is. It's wonderful. I think the weirdest and strangest account that I found was, and I opened with the book on when I talk about Union soldiers, a guy named Joseph Alsbaugh. And he coded his diary in this almost decipherable random code. But I found some people at UC Berkeley who had broken the code to his diary and was able to translate what he was saying. And yeah, if he is looking around at all of the immorality that he sees around him and what Union soldiers were doing, he wanted to remember it, but he wanted to keep it personal. So I felt that was just aligned with so much of the dichotomy of what Union soldiers experienced on the campaign. Some of them pitched into South Carolina, and at the other hand, some of them were appalled at what they were doing. So it's interesting to see how trauma and mental health affected morality among those soldiers.
Yeah. Well, you also, in some of your presentations and things that I've watched, have led off with the story of the monument at Bennett Place. It was 1893. Now, I don't know if this is the right place to transition to that, because we've talked about memory and sort of them looking back on things, and there's some interesting stuff that comes out of that, some resistance that I wasn't really expecting, and a little bit of a backstory to that monument, which really surprised me, based on its intent versus its acceptance or lack of acceptance locally, and so when we're looking back at this from the 1880s and 1890s, which is the period that I live in with with the veterans out here, of course, I spent a lot of time researching and telling their stories of what they did in the war, but it's really their lives here, and it's, those perspectives evolve so much over time, and that's what I was curious about with my last question is, did you see the difference between what they had to say in 1865 in March and April in a journal versus what they said in Confederate magazine or Confederate Veteran magazine in 1902? Because I found that they're not so open and it's not so honest with the struggles. But it seems like you found a key to kind of open that a little bit and seen into it down the road, which I don't so much. So it's interesting that you've found that.
Like you said, been in place. It's the largest surrender of the war, so you think it would be a lot to do it, but that monument didn't go up till 1923.
Oh, 23. I thought it was 18. Yeah. Geez, even later than I thought. Okay.
Yeah, and Durham, it was basically.
Here, I can pull up our picture of that too, so people can see what we're talking about.
So the surrender happened in just a very small railroad town of Durham Station, and which was nothing more than just a blip, a stop on the railroad. And so, but because of the town was occupied by Sherman's cavalry during the negotiations, they were there for a couple of weeks. And, nosy soldiers do what soldiers do. And so they broke into these tobacco warehouses and found this like really delicious bright leaf tobacco. And so when they demobilized and went home, they were like, wow, that's a good smoke. So they would write back to Durham stations like, hey, how can I get some of this bright leaf tobacco? And it fueled the explosion, which made Durham, one of the tobacco capitals of the post-war world. So whenever these new businessmen wanted to really celebrate Durham's origins, it was a no-brainer to kind of mark the site of this monumental happening that was really the cause of Durham's birth. But these were the new businessmen, the new money of the South. And so when they wanted to put up this monument that we see here, the Bennett Place Monument, a lot of the Confederate veterans and the women of the United Daughters of Confederacy were up in arms. And Durham as a whole were pretty ambivalent. And even Union soldiers really weren't interested in participating in this. And the monument is designed as one column represents the North, one the South, with the pediment across the top spelling unity. So it was truly a reconciliation monument. But yeah, those old veterans and their daughters in Durham did not want to see it because they thought it was such an embarrassment, the surrender of what they called one of Lee's army. And they fought it because it was such a painful reminder of this crazy time, this time of great chaos, which left them with, scars they did not want to be picked.
So how lasting were, when we refer to this acute trauma of during the war in 1865, and even the first year or two of Reconstruction, I think is all kind of rolled into one for people living in this area of North Carolina. I don't think there was any stability for some time after the actual surrender. In between then and 1923, do you see that some of the things that are reflected in those traumatic events, other than just an old scab that you don't want to pick off in 1923, but do you see that there's some waves that kind of continue to roll through this region historically from that, with the veterans themselves, with civilians that had lived there, the African-American people that lived there at that point? And I know you'll talk about in your book soldiers' homes and asylums and things later on down the line. So maybe this is a great way to take that exit a little bit too, is how does that memory progress after the war?
Yeah, and it's, throughout the South, we have such a weird weaving in our DNA about this conflict, and it resonates through generations. And it's just this weird subtext that is always kind of pervading the South in such a weird sort of way. I think you can literally see the effect of what goes on at the end of the Civil War in North Carolina is the mental health decline in the population. And again, thanks for the tip off leading me into the asylums. And working in Raleigh, the city of Raleigh just purchased the state's first asylum, the North Carolina Insane Asylum, which opened its doors in 1856. So those records have just opened, and they are such a bountiful collection of data about, who's coming into the asylum before the war, who's coming in during, and especially after. And, I point out in the book that the very first patient was a veteran of the Mexican War who came in with what they called sunstroke, which is one of these euphemisms that we'll see that doctors kind of apply that truly could be some PTSD symptoms. So whenever we can start tracking those people coming into the hospital, not only during the war, but after, it explodes. The population explodes in the post-war years, and it necessitates the state building a second asylum in the western part of the state, but it also necessitates building an asylum for African Americans in Goldsboro, Cherry Hospital. So it really resonates. And I took this out of the book because I was already on thin ice anyway as a historian, start wandering around in scientists' backyard. But there's a new field of epigenetics, which is incredible to think about how, whenever you suffer trauma, that there's such this powerful neurochemical cocktail that takes place in your brain, and these chemicals that your brain produces do leach into your genomes, and they kind of start playing with the switches that you pass on the genes to your offspring. And so there is, science is still coming along, but there is this idea that trauma can be passed in one form or another to generations that came after you. So if you think about the Holocaust, or if you think about all these other, famine, that seems to hold water. But to that point, if you think about African Americans, after 250 years of a sustained trauma, how in the world does that affect their mental health and their, genetics composition? So I think it's hopefully scholars will come up and pick up this torch and carry that a little farther to see if there is a way that we can point back, especially to slavery, and say, yeah, these problems that we still face today come from this experience over 250 years ago.
Sure. So when they're going into, when a veteran goes into an asylum, he's at a point in his life with his struggle with trauma and things, and say 1868, 1870, 1875, kind of early on in the game, what's happening to him? What are the symptoms? What are they diagnosing? What are the treatments at that point? Like, when somebody's in that position that has been in the Army of Tennessee for 4 years, have watched 60% of their friends get their heads blown off, come home to desolation and those sort of things, breaks down through whatever mechanisms were the single trigger, but the results are still the same. What's the fate of that person in these asylums, and what happens to them, and what is trauma thought of as at that time, rather than how we're looking at it now?
When we talk about trauma affecting Civil War soldiers, there are a lot of degrees to that. With trauma just being those nightmares or this painful memories that you can never really get rid of, down to being incapacitated, to be, inability to function. So there's a wide range of what these veterans are going through. And then there's also time. Time plays a lot into this. We see veterans, Union veterans, who go to the Grand Review. They walk right out of the Grand Review into St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Immediate hospitalization. And then you have, 10 years, 20 years later, that finally the war catches them. So, I mean, this is what, we are still, I feel, as a nation, trying to understand the trauma of World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans, that long perspective of how this happens. And, there's a lot of studies that are being done on pension records now. So I think 150 years after the war is over, we are now starting to get a complete picture of what this experience were for Civil War veterans. So yeah, there's many different um, depths of trauma affecting these former soldiers. So a lot of them, especially in the South, if they're lucky enough, are placed in old soldiers' homes, and so these become, as I mentioned in the book, they try to be helpful, but again, you've got a lot of veterans suffering from different problems. So a lot of alcoholism, a lot of drug addiction, a lot of violence, all these old coots fighting each other. By the time that they enter the asylum, usually transferred from the old soldiers' home, they become unmanageable. Um, a lot of them are manic, homicidal, suicidal. They don't eat, and so it is truly like the last gasp for them before they basically die in these asylums.
Yeah.
So it's just the newspapers are so revealing about the plight of a lot of these soldiers, and the newspapers, the archive that we searchable now is incredible, just to tool through, and headline after headline after headline tells us the plight of a lot of these veterans near the end of their lives.
Yeah.
Now, I found also a lot of soldiers committing suicide, not so much of their mental issues, but because they're trying to deal with the pain of their service.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck by the number of soldiers who came up with Bright's disease. And this is sort of a collective term for kidney problems, and it becomes so painful that veterans are like, I can't take it anymore. And so they basically kill themselves as a relief for what their long-term war service has done to their bodies. Yeah. So it's just an incredibly sad story that I think that we are just now starting to unravel.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty good point for me to kind of bring it back for a moment here to the Seattle aspect of things, because like I said when we were talking in the beginning, if it happened in the Civil War, I can connect it to Seattle. Gary Hauser just made an interesting comment here about how it took decades to get past as some of these men moved west, and some of the famous criminals and serial killers and gunfighters, and those violence wasn't just from the left, Quantrill and Bleeding Kansas and those things that spread. This comes from men that fought in Virginia and North Carolina and places as well. But Seattle wasn't exempt from any of this. The men, generally speaking, arrived here towards the tail end of any time frame that we've talked about so far tonight. They didn't really come in significant numbers until the late 1880s, early 1890s. But I'm going to put up, we were talking about headlines, a number of these are all from Seattle. And these are all men, many of which who had fought under Sherman and marched to the sea, and were literally the men that the Union soldiers you've been discussing so far tonight. Like this fellow who had been an officer that just had been despondent. He was intoxicated quite frequently. We hear that a lot. Took his life in a hotel with just to put a pistol next to his head. Here's another Grand Army man from a soldier's home who took a pistol with him, and he had gone into Tacoma from the soldier's home, and he was mad because he had to walk so far, and he shot himself over that. Here's a Confederate veteran of the Western Theater who had also been struggling physically, like you said, who was a very successful real estate dealer. And you would think, 2 or 3 decades of a seemingly well-rounded life. And at the end, this is how he chose to deal with it, was at the end of a gun. And these are all from Seattle. This man killed himself also in what's now Pioneer Square neighborhood of Seattle. And these go on and on and on and on. Here's another one who had tried to poison himself on railroad tracks south of Seattle. And one thing that we see with the men here is that we don't see them write about trauma a lot. We don't see them tell those kind of tales about the war. I think it's because by the time they arrived here, they're really so removed from that. But there's men who killed themselves over rheumatism. That's a chronic rheumatic pain that they just can't deal with. There was one guy, New Jersey soldier, who was in his 80s, and he put a pistol to his head and shot himself. It took 5 tries, which is fascinating. Yeah. So he kept going until he got it done. But his family had no idea. They said he wasn't suffering depression or despondency, wasn't addicted to anything. We have numerous occasions of violence here over things like a borrowed screwdriver. A Civil War veteran shot another man in the head. A Confederate veteran tried to shoot a child because he had hit him with the baseball. They were playing baseball in the street, and the ball bounced over and it hit him in the side, and it triggered him, and he pulled out his pistol and tried to shoot. That's not just a grumpy old man. These are, I mean, it is a grumpy old man, but to shoot at a kid because there's layers and layers to these men that are all come from situations like what you've spoken about here in North Carolina. In many cases, literally, we have so many veterans of the March to the Sea in the Seattle area among these men that dealt with that, and it's everywhere. It's here in Seattle. It's in the asylum or soldiers' home in North Carolina or Maine or Wisconsin or wherever. It's a generation that suffered from this. As you said, World War II and Vietnam, and now far fewer numbers than any of those wars with Afghanistan and Iraq. But those points you had about the discussion of the genetic alteration over time, may tell us a lot 100 years from now.
And that's one of the things I try to slide into the book is that science is providing us an incredible understanding of how the brain works, and we can't diagnose these people who've been dead for so long, but I mean it probably gives us a roadmap to understand a relationship between brain imaging that we see today versus the symptoms in veterans today. And if the veterans are almost word for word mimicking what they're saying from Iraq and saying versus Bentonville, there is some correlation there that really deserves it. And again, there's so much good work being done with really crunching data on pension records for Union soldiers that, again, we are just now starting to get a clearer picture of how this war and this event affected them throughout their entire lives.
Yeah. I will encourage everybody now who's still watching, if you have questions, we're getting a little long here on time, stick them in the comments, because I know I have another 50 questions I could ask. So if I have them, I know you guys watching have them too. So drop those in the comments really quick so we have time for Ernest to answer those. But I always like to ask everybody this. What was the most surprising thing for you out of this? That maybe you had come into it with an idea that was completely destroyed, or there was just so much of something that you didn't expect one way or the other, or something. Like, what was the thing that you're like, I had no idea that was coming when I started this?
When I started this, it was going to be a straight up military narrative, and when I went back and looked at it, I was shocked to see how much I missed in all of those accounts. When I said, all right, I'm going to take out all the bullets, maneuvers, all that stuff, and just look at their emotions and how they're expressing themselves. And once I keyed into that, they just come out of the woodwork. They're just everywhere. Everybody is saying, my neighbor's down the street, she's lost 15 to 20 pounds worrying about her sons of the war. Or this lady would just wander around the streets and repeat her son's last letter to her. And I was like, that's kind of crazy. Or, just the raw emotion of these soldiers, both North and South, that after Lincoln's death, and I've read a lot of Civil War letters and accounts, but I have truly not felt the intensity of the emotion that these soldiers expressed. I was kind of caught off guard about just how at first thunderstruck with sadness these guys were, just brought to their knees, but how fast that sadness curdled and turned into anger, because really they were out for blood. And we talk about, this deviation between total war and hard war. This is one of the times that I feel in the Civil War, it was going to be a Old Testament war in Europe, 100 Years War, total war, decimation of everything that was in the past. So that was truly scary for me to kind of contemplate what would have happened if the armies would have cranked back up and that campaign had gone on after Lincoln's assassination. I might not be here.
Yeah.
So it's just the intensity of that really kind of caught me off guard.
Do you think, on that point, do you think there's any difference between the soldiers that you in your reading between what you saw with the soldiers in those two armies in that situation in North Carolina versus those that were in the Army of the Potomac or elsewhere that maybe saw that it was the war was concluded for them, of course, with that surrender at Appomattox. I'm talking about the Army of the Potomac, but versus being still in this little bit of a tug of war of like, we're not, it's not victory parade yet here in North Carolina. It's still the burner's still on a little bit. Do you find that there's a difference in the rhetoric and what's expressed by those versus elsewhere?
I do.
You do.
These guys with Sherman. Sherman's entire goal was to be the most successful psychological warfare operation of the war. Right? They wanted to bring fear to the Southern populace, and so he had the mindset that he had to mold his army in to do that. And so when they get to the end and, peace is at hand, Lincoln's assassinated, Sherman tells them we're going to get ready to start the campaign again. The negotiations are off. Again, it's this whiplash, and they are so angry right before the final surrender that they are just seething with revenge. And so, it is no nonsense. We are going to destroy everything in our path. I think one soldier said that, we did not feel bound by the constraints of human warfare. So
Wow.
It is just it is scary to think about this. What if they had again got on campaign? So the rhetoric is as caustic as it could possibly be.
Wow. Well, there's two comments here have come up. Another from Gary Hauser. And his comment is that the trauma, the PTSD in particular, is often worse for the losing side. And he refers to the Confederacy, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and so on. So I'd like to say if you feel that it is really comes out worse in one way or the other between the soldiers of those two armies. And then the last thing from Clay Feeder, he refers to prisoners, which we haven't mentioned at all. I think that may be its own total separate topic because there's such different dynamics involved with imprisonment and treatment and that. But does that factor into your book and what you've studied at all? Prisoners that have been freed from places like Columbia, South Carolina, or Andersonville, or wherever, or Confederate prisoners, or whatnot. Is that anything that's come into play with your work in this book?
Yeah, some of the studies of looking at these pension records have kind of cued into factors that had a higher probability of PTSD. So age is a factor. So certainly younger soldiers are more susceptible. Prisoners, if you've been imprisoned, it's more of a stress there, or wounded. So these are sort of the three factors that if your soldier fell into these categories, chances are they would have more lifelong problems from that war experience, and that those three experiences in particular. And I think PTSD is always worse for the loser because there's not really that the celebratory, the grand review, or the World War II parades, and so I think certainly for Southern soldiers and civilians, because the war was fought here and they were involved in, and there was so many more of the population involved, that was much more of a collective trauma where these armies had fought. So, I could really imagine the trauma that was probably across Northern Virginia, if anybody was still left there after those 4 years, that they must have just, and that'd be a great angle of study to see how would you compare Northern Virginia versus the rest of Virginia as far as mental health of the population. So
sure,
yeah, and getting back to Afghanistan, when the country collapsed last year, I've had veterans talk to me and say the same things that I heard veterans say in 1865 in Durham, but just how they felt their cause lost. And I was shocked to see sort of almost the same language, the same sentiment, the same emotions between these two, separated by a century and a half, these two experiences.
Yeah, sure. That rhetoric, the post-war rhetoric from Union veterans of, we won the war on the battlefield and we're losing it at the ballot box. That the Southern planters came back, and in the end, there's certainly been some great books written on that in recent years. About how the South really won the war. That kind of line of thinking a little bit, which not necessarily my line of thinking, but yeah, it still comes back to that, and it's interesting that it would, you'd hear echoes of the same sort of thing. Like, we sacrificed, we fought, we bled, and for what? Because now what? Yeah. Well, I think looks like it for the questions for tonight. I put on the bottom here, Savas Beatie, if there is a code, if you put virtual, you can get 20% off of Ernest's New York Times rave reviewed book from the weekend. So get those before they're sold out, in fact, if you can. So they're kind enough to send a guest a month to talk to our audience about their different work. And I'm really thankful for you for coming on tonight and taking time and just having a conversation with us. I like to do it this way rather than just have you rattle off another presentation and take questions and keep it a little bit more natural in feel. So if anybody doesn't have any more questions, looks like Suzanne Ward, I think she's watching from New Orleans. We got people from Colorado, Florida. Our usual South American viewer hasn't chimed in tonight, so I don't know if he's watching from Colombia or Chile, wherever he's from, or not. But we got a nice diverse group from all over tonight, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And Ernest, thank you so much for coming on. I think we could talk about this for 4 hours. It was a real struggle to kind of like, all right, let me try and kind of touch on a few things as we hopefully get it all. But if you guys are curious about this topic, obviously pick up his book. And where else would you recommend people, if they're interested in this line of scholarship and they want to learn more about the mental side of the war, or its effects, or veterans and things, what would you recommend? I have a few books I could recommend as well, but for further reading, so to speak.
It's a lot coming out on trauma in the Civil War now. I was surprised how many books are just hitting the shelves. Eric Dean was the one that really kind of opened my door. Shook Over Hell, which is the one that really introduced me to the topic.
Well, I have let's see, this Sing Not War is a pretty good one if you've read that. There's of course Drew Gilpin Faust's books on the Republic of Suffering, and trying to find some others to pull off the shelf here. Marching Home, that was just a year or two ago, Brian Jordan's book. That touches on a lot of this stuff in the broader scope of Union veterans and Grand Army men. But I also found that there's a lot of people skimming the surface on this. There's a lot of people that are taking the plunge, and I think your book is a tremendous contribution to that. Everybody out here, grab Ernest's book and support these other historians and scholars as well, because I think all of this stuff is of tremendous value, and it's changing our perception of these men, these individuals, and what they went through and what they continued to do after the war. So I'm glad you guys were here in pretty good numbers watching tonight too. I think it's a worthwhile topic. So,
well, again, I hope the book does some good for modern veterans. That those veterans are coming back who do have issues, that they can say, they are not alone in this. I mean, it is part of the American military experience to some extent. So they walk in the shoes of their forefathers. So don't give up hope, and there is hope to help deal with the issues they come home from war with. So I hope it does some good.
Absolutely. Well said. All right, guys. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. We've been on for about an hour. It's getting late on the East Coast, so I'll let you guys go to bed, and us on the West Coast can go have dinner. So again, thanks everybody from watching from everywhere. Thank you, Ernest, for joining us for a great conversation. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next month. Take care.
Thanks.